Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tuesday, April 22nd edition of the Gateway API Community Sync. As always, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which effectively boils down to be nice to one another, so please do be nice to one another. Please use the raise hand feature in Zoom for questions or interjections, as that helps us to kind of keep things coordinated and flowing during the conversation. This is an open agenda meeting, so if you have something you want to add to the agenda, drop it in the meeting notes here at the bottom. You can put it above triage. If we can get to it today, we will. If not, we can always roll it over to the next meeting. So with that, we will get started on the agenda for today, and we'll start with Rob for 130. Go ahead and take it away, Rob.
Sure. This is, we released RC2. Actually, I think Mattia hit the final buttons sometime on Thursday or Friday, depending on your time zone. And yeah, that seems to have gone all right. And so now we want to move forward from RC2 to the final release tomorrow. If you've seen anything wrong or unexpected in RC2, please let us know. Otherwise, the exact same thing will be called 1.3.0 tomorrow. But yeah, that's all.
Cool. Does anybody have any questions or comments about 1.3? Go ahead, Candace.
I just had a question about the blog. Like, when do we want to? I volunteered to do the blog. When do we want to release the blog? Or
yeah,
do we
let's
not?
aim. No, so what we did the last time, and I think that was effective, was we said we would do 1 month from the release date, and plan and feature any implementations that had submitted conformance reports for that release before the blog went out.
Okay.
So that basically gives implementations 4 weeks or so to get, if you submit your conformance report the same day the blog is supposed to be live, that's too late. But if you give us probably 2-3 days advance notice, that's fine. We can get maybe closer to specifics later. One other thing I noticed on blog post timing is they've added a whole bunch of process to what it takes to get a blog post in now. I think it's a net benefit because it's less confusing than it. I know, but it used to be just completely unknown how things were supposed to work, and so you just kind of guessed, and then people got upset that you weren't guessing right, and whatever.
Where is this written down, Rob?
Yeah, let me drop a link in the agenda. One sec. I thought I would drop a link. Okay. 1 second, but don't feel like you need to delay on my account. We can move on to the next one.
Thanks, Rob. Thank you.
Yeah, suffice to say, there is going to be a blog post. Thank you for volunteering to help with it, Candace. There are some new rules. Check out the new rules. Good luck with them. And we'll do that soon. Anything else on 1.3? Then let's move on. All right, so 1.4.0. There's a scoping and kickoff discussion that some of you may have seen. It was also posted in Slack this morning. A little bit of additional context. So for the last 2 releases, Rob has been getting kind of pinned with being the person to manage those releases.
Which we appreciate. Thank you, Rob.
That was what I was going to get to. Thank you, Rob, for basically picking it up when you got pinned with it and making sure that these releases 1.2 and 1.3 got out the door. In an effort to try to make that situation better, I proposed release managers, basically having even a little bit more formality around like who's going to be responsible for releases and stuff like that. So you get pinned ahead of time and ideally volunteer. And I volunteered for 1.4.0. So you might have seen a release managers.md in the repo now. It's just kind of some guidance for people who will go through this process. So I'm going to try to drive 140, and the kickoff is, I know it was talked about a little bit last week, but we're trying to like make the kickoff kind of happen now. So the idea is that scoping is from now until June 2nd. This is all posted in this discussion. I'm trying.
Wait, hold on.
What,
It's till June 2nd?
yeah, we can move things around, but basically
Oh.
with the six weeks of scoping that we usually talk about, that would put us out to June 2nd.
In the past couple meetings, we aimed for a much shorter scoping phase. I think we knocked it down to 3 weeks. So we may want to adjust for that.
I would like to try to keep the scoping a little bit further out since we're so early, but I'm open to talking about that. Do you want to, maybe we can discuss that one offline, or do you
So
really want to have that?
Shane, this was from, oh my God, where is this? Here we go. This is from the April 8th meeting. And I'd be happy to join an offline discussion with that. The short version, I think, was recognizing that historically it seems that having a 6-week scoping period resulted in people doing nothing for 4 to 5 weeks and then cramming it all into the 6th week anyway. And so maybe shortening it to 3 weeks and having, deliberate check-ins along the way would make life easier for everyone concerned.
I'm open to the suggestion.
Yeah, maybe we talk about that one offline a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a fairly good consensus on previous community meetings, but I don't think you were there, so we can discuss more with you.
Okay. All right, that one can be something we can move around a little bit. Maybe there's a compromise to be had there. I would like to give a little more time, but I understand that the damage that is kind of anticipated is that might make people wait till the end. So yeah, let's have that discussion. We don't need to hold up the show for that. So
yeah,
this may change.
Wow.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Shane, in the Gateway API meeting notes doc for April 8th, you will see a fair chunk of that is written out, although not a lot of the rationale was written out there. So
yeah. So this may change, but the intention with this is to kind of kick things off officially and then say that scoping will be at some point between 3 and 6 weeks. It will freeze up and then this thread will be locked. So my intention, the way I was going about it was, I'd like people, and it's written out in here, to have issues ready, have clarity on the owners. This also needs to be clarity on the reviewers, because I think that was a discussion that was had last week too. And reviewers. So basically know the who of what is going to get put in, and then submit that here for inclusion, or rather for consideration for inclusion. Part of this is because one of the ways I like to work is a little bit more asynchronously. And one of the reasons for that is I can no longer make it to the Monday meetings ever. So it's very helpful for me as I'm trying to manage this release to be doing things a little bit more on the asynchronous side, catching up with people in discussions and issues. So as long as that works for everybody, and nobody has any really strong hatred for like doing more things in discussions and stuff like that, then that's the purpose of this. It's to say, hey, we're going to do this. This is the scoping, and please put your submissions in here for inclusion so that I can come back to this as the place to compile things from and to have discussions asynchronously. That was the intention. So there's this, and then there's a tracking issue, which is basically just tracking the eventual release and has some links to important things, including the scoping and also the milestone. The milestone has information on it, basically where the same information as that, but also a due date and a feature freeze. This feature freeze is a little aggressive, kind of intentionally so, with the intention of releasing on November 1st, a full week before KubeCon North America. So that's that. And things are flexible. We can certainly tweak things a little bit here, but it's my intention to try to go through the release cycle and basically be on top of things. I may reach out to individuals. So if you do post in this discussion, and I may ping you on Slack depending on if there are questions or something like that. Do we have anything from that last meeting that was a confirmed, we are absolutely going to, we have authors and reviewers lined up for a specific, we'll say, feature or big piece of maintenance that is going to transition to either standard or experimental during this release cycle. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I had a few questions about the specifics here. Just in the past, everything's been, in the discussion first and then transition to issues if it got, accepted. In this world, where do you expect discussion to happen? In the discussion or on the issue?
Yeah, I would say, well, I mean, and I'm open to changing it, but ideally what I'd like people to have is bring the issue, like have the issues written up and ready to go, then and know who you're going to involve and then submit it for this release. If everybody really prefers, bring it up for discussion and then discuss that down into an issue, I'm okay with that. We can switch that
Yeah,
up.
one note is that the discussion template we used in the past did require people to, basically have owners when they submitted it, but it just wasn't an issue. So, depending on what you're looking for out of an issue, it could be possible with the discussion. My concern with with separate issues is it may make it ambiguous where you vote on things, or it may split the discussion in two, basically.
Okay, where do you think? So if we have this and people come in with comments with their issues in the comments, and the votes would be on those comments, where would the split happen?
Maybe pull up one of the previous scoping discussions just for kicks. I think it's probably still pinned unless you've.
Is this one?
No, at the very top.
Or not RC.
At the very top. No, very top. No, it's like the big things. Yeah, maybe do the not standard one because standard was always kind of stupid. Because anything that wanted to graduate to standard,
There's the pull quote for this meeting. Standard was always stupid.
Yes, perfect. I'm not saying we recreate this verbatim, but what I would it may help to see how it worked in the past of.
Yeah, I mean, I remember these. I was trying something a little bit different. If that is not ideal for everybody.
I don't. Yeah, I mean,
the one thing I was trying to do that was different was put everything in one pipeline, whether it's going to standard or experimental. I think that has the value of having everything in one place and knowing kind of where effort and who is going to actually be on things. But I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But Shane, your idea here is that you would. Okay, so, to make this concrete, I, for some crazy reason, offered to write the GEP defining default gateways and such. So your idea here is that I would create an issue around default gateways, and then I would put a comment in this kickoff and scoping discussion saying, hey, Flynn is insane and is talking about default gateways, and here's a link to the issue. But presumably I would stick an overview in the discussion so that we would have a summary that people could then vote on whether they thought that was a good idea. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's what I'm getting at. Yep.
Okay. I mean, I'm fine with trying that. I think that I think I could argue it being a good idea, a bad idea, or an indifferent idea, in which case we should probably try it and see how it works.
Okay, Rob?
Yeah, I don't have any, the main thing that I want to get out of here is that the same questions are answered somewhere and that there's a clear idea of if I want to voice my support for a feature, where I put that.
Let me get this.
I don't care if it's.
Yeah.
Like if you want that to be an issue, that's great. If you want that to be inline, that's great too. I don't care so much, just as long as we get answers to those questions.
I think I feel like the issue is probably a good place to talk about the nuts and bolts of how a particular thing is going to happen, and the support stuff, somebody voicing, oh yeah, I like this idea or something like that, having that in the discussion probably makes sense to me. And Pooja, to answer your question from chat, no, I do not have such a gap already written, but for some strange reason, I decided it would be a good idea to claim that I could write such a thing. So
All right,
if
Rob,
you're
does
interested, or if anybody else is interested, love to hear what people are talking about, or people are thinking about it.
Yeah,
does that,
definitely interested in talking about it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
does that make things seem a little bit better than, Rob, that basically if you post here, follow the template that we had before, as opposed to it being just provide an issue? But I added, give us the issue link. Is that okay? Is that a good
Yeah, I
compromise?
mean, sure, yeah. The other question is does that mean that voting also happens? You know, if you want to voice your support for a feature, it should happen in the discussion.
That was what I
or
had anticipated we would do. People would upvote.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Any other concerns that I should address?
No, I just, you know, because not everyone that sees this is going to be on the meeting, it would be helpful. Okay, no, I do see. If you already have clarified that you should upvote or voice support for things that you want to see move forward, I would do that.
Let's do. Whoop. Okay.
And
I'll add that here.
you know, one other thing is, frankly, the requirements for something like graduating standard are meaningfully different than the requirements for something that's new. And the questions there are very focused on something that's net new. We'd probably need a different set of questions for something that was going to graduate to standard. I don't know how to handle that, but just yeah.
Okay. I'll do a little bit more workshopping on that then. Maybe we do just have the separate. Maybe I'll just kind of clean this one up and make it the graduates to standard scoping, and then I'll link to another discussion that handles the experimental graduates to experimental scoping, and just keep it simple. Sound good?
Sure, it doesn't need to be a separate discussion, but that was something that seemed a bit easier to me in the past. I don't have a huge opinion.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. Yeah, I'm fine with that. Okay. I don't see any issue with the experimental being a separate discussion, and then it does give you the kind of like separation of language. So we'll do that. So other than that, my intention will be during the Tuesday meetings, which I can make, to kind of do regular updates on this as we move forward. I will double check and we'll talk about maybe if there's a better, if we're going to have a different compromise on when the scoping concludes. Anything else? Yeah, I think that's it. So pretty much, please do join that discussion, even though this discussion will be changing. If you have some, I'll change it basically probably right either during this meeting or right after. So please check this out and get ready to start advocating for what you want to see included. So that was that topic. Rob, you wanted to talk about GEP 713 enhancements.
Yeah, no. So I finally, you know, one, it takes forever to load this PR because there's been a lot of comments. Thank you, Guy, for your thoughtful. I mean, one, having like read a good chunk of this now, I am impressed by how much Guy thought about this and how, you know, how thoughtfully this was written. Thank you. This has a lot of really great stuff in it. I just wanted to have a discussion more broadly about if there's a smaller version of this that we can get in sooner. Like this PR includes a lot. So if there's any way we can try to cut scope and just focus on, you know, stabilizing the base that's already mostly defined and then have follow-ups for the new things proposed here. I don't know. Maybe this has already been discussed.
Yeah, let me take on this one. Thanks, Rob. To be fair, I didn't put as much work on the idea itself, as much as I had to do on mainly finding the words to define or to explain what the multiple implementations are already doing, right? So I think the most part of the book consists of going through the documentation of the different implementations, see how they define policies, how they work, and try to come up with some text that would cover for all those cases in a very generic way, and still feels like it's a framework that is being proposed rather than just calling out the different practices out there, right? But now back to your review and to your suggestion of trying to break that pull request down into smaller chunks. I think you raised three major changes there as particularly concerning, and the other ones I think are quite straightforward. For example, you also mentioned things like what is the actual status for the two gaps that we would be replacing, right? And I think it was Nick who first suggested using declined, I think, for the gap 26, 48, and 49, and now you're proposing replaced. I think fine by me, no problem. Also, a couple other things that you also suggested that I'm totally fine with. The three big ones that I would like to mention in more details are, you mentioned the difference in the concept of meta resources versus policy, right? And maybe that was a bit of a misunderstanding on my part. But I think it's an interesting one, especially for us to take offline later on. I'm very, very interested to hear of what other people have to say about that one. I also left a few open questions there, to maybe try to help the conversation here. But I think that's an interesting one, whether we are trying to define and give more structure for what we call meta resources, or keep it a rather loose definition for meta resources and just be more specific about what we call policies, right? And separate those two concepts. So that's one. And another one is you also mentioned the addition of label selectors as a way to target the resources. And I think my point there is mainly what do we do with the implementations that are already doing label selectors, right? Should we keep as is today and outside of the spec, or are we ready, to bring into the spec? And I mentioned two of them that I'm aware of.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Which implementations do label
Envoy
selection?
Gateway is they went with label selectors, and for very different reasons. Istio as well, right? I think Istio already had label selectors, and then they started moving to target refs, but without really deprecating label selectors. Whereas Envoy Gateway did the other way around, right? So they had target refs from the very beginning, and then they realized they needed something broader than that, and they introduced label selectors, if I'm not wrong. So anyway, the point being that now we have more than one implementation that are already doing label selectors for targeting the resources. So if we decide to give that out of the spec, I mean, I'm fine, right? I'm just saying that we may need to have an answer to those, and whenever they ask, right, what that means for them in that case. And again, more than happy to take that offline as well, no problem. And the third point, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, my goal was just to discuss this in a broader group, because I recognize that I've probably missed some key discussions here, and others have opinions, I'm sure, as well. My concerns with I'm not, I know there's been a common request for label selectors in policy attachment, but it's not something that we have formalized yet, and I am hesitant. Like, I don't know. It's not that I want to say we shouldn't do it all outright. I would just rather have a discussion just about that, where this is just this particular PR already includes a lot, and moving to label selectors is to me, a pretty large I know that there
I would
are
go
a
so
couple-
far as to say that I would like to not specify label selectors in this round of this PR, because first, because you're right, it seems to add an incredible chunk of scope to something that is already quite scopeful, if that's a word.
It
But
seems like
also
a reasonably
because,
additive.
say again?
It seems like it reasonably could be additive of like, as long as we design with, hey, we might want to
Right.
do this in the future, that could be additive.
It feels like a thing we could add later and not bite off that extra scope right now. It also feels like a thing that could make the discoverability problem worse than it already is, and that worries me as well. So for both of those reasons, I would prefer not to have label selectors in this particular change right now.
Yeah, well, I do agree that it's the kind of thing that's easy to add later. And I think
Yeah.
my only point is, what does that mean, for the ones already doing it?
It
So I
means
think
that
the
they're doing
question that you
something, it means that they have chosen to extend a resource in a way that happens to not be covered by the spec, but which they can certainly do, right?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
right.
Yeah. In much the same way as an implementation could decide that a type of backend ref in a route that isn't a service is fine. And, that's part of our extensibility story. So I don't think that's a
Mhm.
problem.
Right. Okay, no problem for me. I mean, as I was saying, I have no personal opinion on this particular point. On the implementation that I represent, we happen not to be supporting label selector just yet. So fine. It's mainly, how we want to respond to those other ones. No problem. And
Yeah.
as to the point that raised by Flynn, about the discoverability problem, we do not have to stress that too much. But personally, I don't think that it changes a lot, considering that people in general would not sort resources by target refs, right? In the sense that the problem continues to be the same. You need to somehow flag
Let's
that the resource
let
has been affected as being affected, right?
yeah, let's come back to that later. I
Sure.
I think we could 100% rat hole the rest of this meeting on that one topic, and I think that would probably be not desirable.
You could easily, right? I'll let Kenneth speak.
Yeah.
I
Candace?
just have I just have a suggestion that we sort of time bound even this PR. I mean, I know it contains a lot of information and there's a lot of back and forth on it, but could we put a date that says, after April 30th, we're no more debate is allowed. And just as I think Rob or Shane, someone suggested earlier, to peel off the parts that are still under debate as separate as separate issues and as not yet set in stone or implementation dependent, as of in an effort to get this merged, because I think a lot of people are relying on this being merged.
Yeah, plus one. I really want to say, I really want to aim to get this in as soon as we possibly can, and that was kind of why I was hoping to aim for as narrow a scope as, because we already have 260. A chunk of those are my comments, but there's been a lot of good discussion around this, but I do want to get to a point where we can just get this in and not have it drag on forever. Guy, thank you for your patience on this one, and yeah, let's get
No
this
worries.
to,
Yeah, and I'm okay with time boxing, no problem. But that leads me to my last point, which is one of the things that was suggested, to keep out of this iteration, was the definition of this concept of merge strategy. And I honestly would not know how to leave this out, because it was my understanding that was the main goal, right? The main goal was to consolidate those two classes of policies we had before into separate gaps, right? Back into one single gap, directed and inherited, around this concept of merge strategy. So that was my understanding since we first discussed that back in the last KubeCon North America, right? So maybe something changed since there, or not sure, but that is something to be discussed further if we really want to keep that out. Because I would need to rethink, the whole structure of this, and actually even what we are doing, right? What is the actual enhancement if not, merging direct and inherited around that concept?
So that's I guess the current state of policy attachment, the merging semantics have been rather implementation specific or unspecified. Is that fair to say? And your argument is that before we make this GA, we need to standardize on some approach.
Actually, can I
Yeah,
ask one other question related to that? Guy, is it your sense that the question around merge strategy in this doc had more to do with defining merge strategies or more to do with allowing users to select merge strategy at runtime?
those are two different things, right? So I think defining merge strategy, I mean, we're just coining the term, right? But the
Right.
concept already exists. So in my
And that
opinion,
kind of gets
what we
back to what
call
Rob is saying, where we're both defining it and talking about, here's a standard way that merges should happen, right?
and that my point is that I think we did that already, right? And actually, I actually have a question to all of you, because it feels like that maybe some of the perception that this pull request is, I don't know, like too much to handle, could be due to gateway API mainly being focused so far more on direct policies rather than inherited, while the inherited part has always been mostly left for the implementation to figure out, right? Because if you go back to the gap that defined inherited, those things are there. In fact, Gateway Cuddle implemented those things, right? How you merge two policies together. There's an actual statement saying that you can merge those two policies together at this color level. And as a reference to or an indirect reference to JSON patch operation, right? And that's what Gateway Cuddle had to do. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's all there. By merging again those two classes of policies into one, I mean, it becomes explicit that we already have all that complexity per se, right? But it's not like we're inventing any new complexity. So when I say, let's call default a merge strategy or override a merge strategy, let's acknowledge that sometimes we want to perform a patch operation or JSON patch between two specs. Sometimes we want something simpler than that, which is a full replacement of one spec with another. I'm only trying to call all of that, give a name to all of that. And the name I chose was merge strategy, but it could be anything else.
So I get that rationale, and I see the usefulness of it. One concern I have, if I understand the proposal correctly, is that it is moving not just to providing a name for it, but making it configurable on every individual instance of a policy. And that feels like it's something that could lead to a great deal of challenge for implementations that already support policy. So one idea that may make this a little bit easier to handle would be, instead of making this configurable from the outset, we define a recommendation that implementations populate in status or something like that. This is the merge strategy that I'm using, right? And so then we can follow up with a configurable merge strategy as a future enhancement. And we've still defined the idea of merge strategy and standardized terminology without requiring any implementation to support arbitrary, ones that they don't today.
I'll respond to all that. I was basically going to say,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but how is that different from what we have today? I mean, today you can already define at each individual CR. You can create a CR in an inherited policy that defines overrides and another one in the same hierarchy that defines the defaults. And you need to deal with that.
Okay, I see. Sure, that's fair. So I'll
That's
give the example of
Mhm.
GK, for example, where we have never supported overrides, and so our policies are default only. I mean, we've actually never supported any form of hierarchical anything. We have tried to future-proof it by putting our config under defaults, just in case we support multiple levels of attachment in the future. But that's it. So, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I feel like the implementation of overrides is not very widespread. I feel like it's a thing that was written into the spec, and then a thing that a lot of people looked at it and went, this seems more complex than we actually need, chose not to implement it. And so there's an interesting line between defining it and dictating that implementations must also do new behaviors. And I would like to avoid dictating that implementations have to do new behaviors, while I think that defining is a great idea. Does that make sense?
It does, but the way I'm hearing this now, it's almost like we're proposing removing things from the current spec as well. Right? So the current spec defines overrides.
Well-
And because it's not as widespread, then
Mm-hmm.
we're saying that maybe a good way to move forward with the pull request is to remove that from the existing spec as well. Is that right?
Were
no,
overrides
no.
ever Well, were
No.
overrides ever anything other than implementation specific?
Sorry, can you
Not
repeat that? I
really.
didn't get
No,
that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
Geek's
don't think
point.
overrides are part of the core spec right now. I think that they may be extended and they may be implementation specific, and I honestly have to go back and look. But I feel like what we're saying is less, let's remove them from the spec, and more, let's not make them any more standard than they already are.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I don't
mean,
think.
I would say having a standard way to describe behavior is useful, but not require like that's
Yeah.
where I'm trying to draw the line here of if you support this, then you have a standard way to communicate the specific strategy that you're supporting in status without actually requiring all implementations to support configurable, like, and I get your point, Key. There's already a version of policy that includes overrides and defaults, but I think even the specific mechanics of how overrides and defaults were implemented was still underspecified and or implementation specific.
Time
Or
check.
both.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
my
and
hope is also that like by defining something in status of like you're describing this is how my policy is merging defaults and overrides and that could potentially allow implementation specific configurability without putting it as an explicit part of the thing, because that way you're able to describe this is the behavior that is happening. And the input to that, it could be opaque, it could be just an implementation decision that's not exposed, or you could possibly consider exposing it. So in that way, I think that even without adding that configurability as part of the spec, having it in status at least formalizes communicating how that is working, is my hope.
To be clear, I have no problem with reporting that in the status, and in fact, that is already covered in the pull request. I think the problem is if defaults and overrides are a thing, then how one would specify that it's a default or an override. So I think one proposal came from Nick was they don't. So it's part of the design of the policy kind, right? So it's the CRD, it's either for a default or for an override semantics, and that's it. The user never gets to choose. That's what's one proposal, right? And that changes significantly from the current spec. The current spec says that there are actually fields for it, right? There's a field called defaults. There's a field called overrides. And in the discussion, we decided that one of the things would be either one or the other, but never both. I think that was one of the outcomes of the long GitHub discussion we had. But they are currently something that the user could specify if the design of the policy kind would allow, right? As Rob pointed out, and also Flynn confirmed later on, not too many implementations are doing that. Maybe Quadrant is the only one that's crazy enough to go all the way with the current spec and implemented both defaults and overrides, right? But again, I think the decision that needs to be made is if one is allowed to design a kind of policy that lets you specify defaults or overrides or even other kinds of merge strategies, then how do we specify that? For sure, that should be reflected in the status afterwards. I think there's no, I'm not challenging that in any way. Sorry, Shane.
I'm mostly here to time check. Do we have a good, it doesn't sound like we have conclusions here. Do we have a good way to follow up on this? Should we bump it and talk about it again during the next meeting? Is there a discussion that would be a good place to follow up? I don't recommend following up in the PR, just because it's very nested. So maybe extracting this bit, if we're going to follow up async somewhere, would be good.
Sure, we can try, again, come up with another meeting dedicated to this if you think that helps. I'm okay. Or try to reiterate on that document we once opened and async, go through these ideas again. I'm being quite frank here. I struggle to see a future for that PR without merge sets. The concept of merge sets somehow defined, right? Even if that concept is basically only based on the ones that already exist. What is defaults and what's overrides and JSON patch. Those are only things that we already have in GAP 2649.
Roger that. Before we ask for I think adding it as another conversation point for a regular meeting would be fine. I'm inclined to say, and I'm open to suggestions, but I'm inclined to say, before we ask for people to jump on another meeting just dedicated to this topic, I think you should do some shopping around with people in the community to see if you can find somebody who is aligned to bring that conversation up with you. Basically, somebody who's like, yeah, actually, this makes sense for us as well. And then bring up that conversation. Because I think one of the problems is right now it's not clear that, I think if I'm reading the room right, you have a strong need that other people are confused about. So getting at least one other person on board to help bring some more perspective and stuff like that seems like a good next step to be able to move that forward as a conversation.
Yeah, no problem for me. Right? I can do that. But sorry to insist that I need to be clear. That's not about the need I'm representing here at all. Right? That is mainly about the goal we had originally, given the existing specs. Right? So we have specs that already define those concepts. We're trying to redefine them or consolidate them into one single document back again. I think that's it, right? So we can completely remove Quadrant out of the picture and as one example of implementation, and I think we still have the same problem to do with.
Sure. I guess I may have used language that made it seem like I was pointing at Quadrant, but I think I was just more meaning like, I read the room as people are just kind of confused. Did I read that wrong?
I'm not confused. It's just a question of like, our users are not necessarily, this is speaking for Istio generally, and from what I've seen issues is our users aren't necessarily asking for this degree of configurability. I understand the concepts, and the concepts are an extremely useful way of describing very explicitly the behavior that's happening. But really we're kind of like just brushing across the surface of we need some basic policies before users are getting into like needing this degree of configurability of them.
Okay.
Yeah, I am in a
Are there
similar boat
objections?
where the defining the manner in which merging happens makes a lot of sense to me. requiring configurability makes a lot less immediate sense to me. And given that I don't think a lot of people currently implement overrides, I'm inclined to not want to require people to implement overrides. But to me, those are three very separate things, and the concept of defining how merging works absolutely makes sense to me. So I'm kind of trying to tease those three things apart in my head.
So what is a good way for us to support Guy as a community then? It seems like we're at odds to some degree. He has been burning the midnight oil trying to keep this thing going forward. How can we support moving this forward quickly? My suggestion was maybe that was based on kind of maybe a misunderstanding that there was confusion. If there's not
No,
confusion and there's more like contention, how do we resolve this so we can kind of get this huge bundle of work to a conclusion?
yeah. So my suggestion, which I think there's contention here too, is that we try to really narrow scope as much as we can. So the areas that I think are potential for contention are merge strategy and label selectors in the target refs. And I am suggesting that if merge strategy becomes informational, we basically define standards and allow implementations to communicate that is what they're doing, as opposed to making it, fully configurable, may help make this a little bit, seem more optional, which I think is one of the key points Flynn is trying to suggest, and still support the overall goal of standardizing on concepts, right? This is what it means for this merge strategy to be in place. And I would argue that both merge strategy as being configurable and label selectors and target refs are both 100% additive changes in the future to this, and don't, in my opinion, need to block this initial PR.
Okay. So then the ask seems to be, can we move these things out of the current PR so we can merge the current PR and have them be an iteration beyond this PR?
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand the ask. We're gonna need more time, to get into details of it, because I insist. I don't think it can be done. I think what's being asked is different than what was said. We already have that as a configurable thing today. That's what I'm saying, without the pull request. So what's being
Right. You
asked
mentioned this
is,
before. It's
can we
already
remove
there.
from the current? It's already there. Can we remove that from the current spec? And then I'm fine with it.
So
Can it be caveated then in a meaningful way? If it's already there and we can't just pull it because that would be removing something that was already there, this PR is just trying to help move things along. Rob, do you think that we could caveat it in some way that would be sufficient for people who are coming into this documentation?
I guess I misunderstood the gap. I thought that you had a configurable merge strategy that was different than what the spec already has. Did I misread that? Like, I know
To
defaults.
be completely clear here, Guy, you're saying that we have a configurable merge strategy in that you can choose to label something as an override or a default. Am I
Yes,
understanding you correctly, or
that's
is there more
correct.
to it than
Yes.
that? Okay.
No, that's correct.
I had thought that you were proposing another way to configure merge strategy per object. Am I misremembering that?
I'm not proposing another way. What
Okay.
I'm doing is I'm saying there is this thing that it's merge strategy, right? It's not called merge strategy, but now we're calling it merge strategy, right? The current spec says you can, as a policy designer, one who designs a policy, you can decide to add it or not to add it. But if you do add it, right, that is how you do it. And I'm saying that others are doing this other way. That's what I'm saying in the current pull request. I don't know if that's clear. I can come up with some example, but If you go back to 2649, what it says is you can do both defaults and overrides in one policy kind that you design, right? So it says you can define the spec of it and you can add a field called overrides and then the actual fields of your policy. Or you can add a field called defaults and then the actual fields of your policies. And they can be mutually exclusive, meaning you can have two CRs of the same kind. One says overrides, another one says defaults. That's all 2649. It was so vaguely written that basically allows for that. And we, Quadrant, the implementation I represent, read that quite literally, and we did that, right? So it is possible today. What I'm saying is that there are more than that. The spec also says that you can JSON patch those two resources together, right? Or not. If you do it, then how do you specify what you're doing?
Maybe I think what I'm describing is not as far off from what you have as maybe it sounds. So I looked through the gap again just to clarify, and you have defined 5 options or merge strategies that I see. So there's none, there's atomic defaults, atomic overrides, patch defaults, and patch overrides. And I think that's useful information. My suggestion is that we have not currently made the distinction between atomic and patch something that is configurable for a user. And I would rather make that distinction something that is communicated in status to a user. And the configurability of that could be a follow-up.
So we would keep only the merge one, right? The JSON patch one, and not the atomic one. Because the atomic, that wasn't that to try to limit it more, the scope, and not the other way around.
No, to clarify, like we already have this idea that some policies can include defaults and overrides fields. What we have not clarified on is, how those should be handled. And your PR is useful in that it defines some very clear definitions of atomic and patch as ways that you can handle either one of defaults or overrides. I'm suggesting that instead of making that user configurable to start, we make that distinction something that is communicated in status instead.
We are practically out of time.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, Anderson.
So
thanks.
We have some kind of conclusion. It seems like, at least we can follow up in Slack, maybe.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good. With that, we've got 1 minute, so we don't really have any time for triage. I guess real quick before we go, I did want to point out that I updated those discussions. There are now 2. So they follow the previous ones a little bit closer and have templates. Please check those out, and please start posting the things that you want to have included in 140 standard and experimental, because somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks, which we'll figure out after this and update, we will be closing the scoping for that. And I put this in the parking lot too for maybe continued conversation about GEP 713, but let's follow up in Slack at least and continue that conversation, because it does sound like we're heading towards, there was some misunderstanding at some level, and it sounds like we may be heading towards some conclusions. So that's good. And that's the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for your time. Thank you everyone for your hard work. We appreciate all of you. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.